An empire wasn't broken by a shield wall. It was broken by greed. For 7 days, a Frankish line held against the world's finest cavalry until the charge stalled. Then a soldier saw the impossible, the enemy commander's tent being ransacked by his own men. The borders on your map are not permanent, they are scars. These 10 moments erased entire futures from existence, and the question remains, how many of them were not an accident? Number 1 is the battle that built a wall of bodies to halt an empire. For decades, the Umayyad Caliphate had been an unstoppable force, a wave of conquest that had swept from the Arabian Peninsula, across North Africa, and into the Iberian Peninsula, crushing the Visigothic kingdom. By 732, the governor of Al-Andalus, Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, was leading a massive army north past the Pyrenees and into the heart of Francia. To the fragmented Frankish kingdoms, it looked like the end. But one man, an illegitimate son of a powerful dynasty, saw not an apocalypse, but an opportunity. His name was Charles, and he was about to earn his title, Martel, the Hammer. The shocking core of the Battle of Tours isn't just that the Franks won, it's how they won. Charles Martel did the unthinkable against the era's dominant military force, the heavy cavalry. He chose his ground, a wooded, elevated plain that would disrupt a cavalry charge. And then he told his men to do nothing. For 7 days, the two armies stared each other down. Abd al-Rahman, confident in his horsemen, launched probing attacks. The Frankish infantry, a mix of seasoned veterans and levies, locked their shields and held. Arabic accounts describe them with a kind of awe and horror. A wall of ice, a human glacier that could not be moved. The Umayyad cavalry, the most feared weapon in the world, crashed against them and broke. Then, on the 7th day, Abd al-Rahman ordered a full-scale assault. The charge was immense, a thunder of hooves meant to shatter the Frankish line through sheer force. It failed. As the Umayyad horsemen reeled back, a rumor, possibly started by Martel's own scouts, ripped through their rear ranks. The Franks were looting their camp, where the spoils of their campaign were stored. You can almost hear it. The shriek of a horse, the splintering of a shield, the guttural roar of men packed so tightly they can barely swing their axes. But then a new sound, confusion, greed overriding discipline. A significant portion of the Umayyad cavalry peeled away from the main assault, racing back to protect their loot. Abd al-Rahman, seeing his army disintegrate, rode into the fray to rally them. It was there, surrounded by chaos, that a Frankish spear found him. The Caliphate's commander was dead. The army's will died with him. They did not retreat. They routed. That night, under the cover of darkness, they fled south, leaving their tents, their wounded, and their ambitions in the mud of Francia. What this battle reveals is that empires don't always fall to grand strategy. Sometimes they simply break against a wall of stubborn, terrified men who have been ordered not to take a single step back. The victory cemented Charles Martel's power, laying the foundation for his grandson, Charlemagne, to build the Carolingian Empire. It didn't just save a kingdom, it created the very concept of a unified Christian Western Europe, a political and cultural map that would endure for 1,000 years. And the next clash of civilizations on our list would be decided by a secret. Number 2 is the battle you've never heard of, but it's the reason the words you're reading right now exist on a screen and not a scroll. In the middle of the 8th century, the two largest empires on Earth were on a collision course. In the East, the Chinese Tang dynasty, a golden age of cosmopolitan culture and military might, was expanding westward along the Silk Road. In the West, the newly risen Abbasid Caliphate, having just overthrown the Umayyads, was pushing east, consolidating its power. Their meeting point was the Talas River, in modern-day Kyrgyzstan. This wasn't just a border skirmish. This was a fight for the soul of Central Asia. The setup was a classic imperial proxy war. The Tang, under the command of the great general Gao Xianji, allied with local tribes to assert their dominance. The Abbasids, led by Ziyad ibn Salih, did the same. In July of 751, their main armies finally met. For 5 days, the battle was a bloody stalemate. The Tang army, with its elite crossbowmen and disciplined heavy infantry, held a tactical advantage. The Abbasid force, composed of ferocious Arab and Persian horsemen, was larger and fighting closer to home. The battle could have gone either way. The future of Asia, whether it would be shaped by Confucian bureaucracy or Islamic jurisprudence, hung in the balance. The shocking core is what happened on the 5th day: betrayal. The Karluk Turks, a nomadic mercenary contingent fighting for the Tang, suddenly switched sides in the middle of the battle. They didn't just desert, they turned and attacked the Tang army from the rear, while the Abbasids launched a furious frontal assault. The disciplined Tang lines, caught in a perfect pincer, collapsed into chaos. Imagine you are a Tang soldier. For days you have held the line against screaming cavalry charges. The dust is so thick it turns the sun a dull red. You smell sweat, blood, and the hot metal of your own armor. You trust the men on your flank, the Karluk horsemen who have fought with you for weeks. Then, from behind you, you hear not the familiar Tang war horns, but the high-pitched battle cries of the steppe. The cavalry that was supposed to be protecting your rear is now spearing your comrades in the back. The line dissolves into a panicked slaughter. General Gao Xianji barely escaped with his life. Thousands of Tang soldiers were killed, and thousands more were captured. The immediate result was a redrawing of the map. The Tang dynasty's westward expansion was halted permanently. Never again would a Chinese empire exert direct control so far into Central Asia. The region would, over the coming centuries, convert to Islam, a geopolitical reality that remains to this day. But the deeper world-changing consequence came from the prisoners of war. Among the thousands of captives taken by the Abbasids were skilled artisans and craftsmen. 2 of them, according to the Arab historian Al-Tha'alabi, were Tu Huan and Cheng Chong. They were paper makers. Before Talis, papermaking was a closely guarded Chinese secret. The Abbasids, recognizing the value of this incredible technology, established the first paper mill outside of China in Samarkand, using the knowledge of these prisoners. From there, paper spread to Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, and then into Europe via Islamic Spain. It replaced expensive parchment and papyrus, fueling the Islamic Golden Age and later the European Renaissance. Every book, every scientific treatise, every revolutionary tract, every map that would be redrawn for the next millennium owes its existence to a betrayal on a dusty riverbank in Kyrgyzstan. And from a secret that changed the world, we go to a single arrow that changed a nation. Number 3 is a story of sheer, bloody-minded exhaustion. Everyone knows the date, 10-6. But what you may not realize is that the Battle of Hastings was the final, desperate act in a year of unbelievable violence, fought by an army that should have already been dead. In September, King Harold Godwinson of England had just performed one of the most stunning military feats of the Middle Ages. He had force-marched his army nearly 200 miles north in 4 days to surprise and annihilate a massive Viking invasion led by Harold Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. His kingdom was saved. He had barely a week to celebrate before he received the news. William, Duke of Normandy, had landed his own invasion force on the south coast. So Harold did it again. He turned his battered, exhausted army around and marched them 250 miles south in about 11 days. He gathered what fresh levies he could along the way, but the core of his force were the same men who had just fought a brutal battle to the death. On October 14th, he arrived near Hastings and took up a defensive position atop a ridge, forming the iconic Saxon shield wall. William's army, a mix of Norman knights, archers, and mercenaries, was fresh, rested, and eager for battle. The stakes were not just a throne, they were the entire future of England. Would it remain an Anglo-Scandinavian kingdom oriented towards the North Sea, or would it be tied permanently to the culture, language, and politics of continental Europe? The shocking core of Hastings is the brutal 9-hour grind. For most of the day, Harold's strategy worked. The shield wall was impenetrable. Norman cavalry charged up the hill, only to be butchered by the English housecarls with their terrifying long-handled axes. William's army almost broke. At one point, A rumor spread that William himself had been killed, and he had to ride amongst his troops, lifting his helmet to show his face, screaming that he was still alive. The turning point came from a combination of Norman cunning and English indiscipline. The Normans began to execute feigned retreats, galloping down the hill as if in a panic. Twice, groups of English ferdmen, smelling victory, broke the shield wall to chase them, only to be surrounded and cut down on the flat ground. The sensory experience of that wall must have been hellish. The deafening crash of steel on wood, the screams of men and horses, the ground turning to a slick red mud beneath your feet. For 9 hours you stand shoulder to shoulder, your shield arm numb, your ears ringing, your vision tunneled. You see the Norman knights charge, retreat, charge again. You hold. You hold. But as dusk began to fall, William ordered his archers to change their tactics. Instead of firing directly at the wall, he had them arc their shots high to plunge down on the men behind the shields. It was a desperate, almost random gambit. And one of those arrows found the sky, reached its apogee, and came down into the eye of King Harold Godwinson. The King of England was dead. His death shattered the English morale. The shield wall, which had held for an entire day against impossible odds, finally broke. The Normans swarmed over the ridge, and the battle became a massacre. The English aristocracy was systematically dismantled and replaced by a new Norman elite. The English language was transformed, infused with thousands of French words. The very map of power in Britain was redrawn. England was pulled from its northern orbit and chained to the destiny of France for the next 400 years. All because an exhausted army's discipline failed and a single anonymous arrow found its mark. But as devastating as losing a king is, number 4 shows what happens when an empire loses its soul. Number 4 is the story of an empire that died, but didn't know it for another 400 years. The Byzantine Empire, the direct inheritor of Rome, saw itself as the center of the civilized world. By the 11th century, it was a shadow of its former glory, but it still controlled a vast territory, including the heartland of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. This region was the empire's breadbasket and its primary recruiting ground for soldiers. But a new power was rising from the east, the Seljuk Turks, a nomadic people who had converted to Islam and carved out a massive sultanate. Their leader, Alp Arslan, the valiant lion, was more interested in fighting the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt than the Byzantines. But his Turkish raiders were relentlessly pushing into the Byzantine frontier. In 1071, the Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes decided to put an end to it. He gathered a colossal army, perhaps as many as 200,000 men according to some exaggerated sources, and marched east to restore the border. The shocking core of Manzikert is not the battle itself, but the utter strategic collapse it represented. Alp Arslan, upon hearing of the Byzantine advance, was caught by surprise. He had a much smaller, more mobile force of around 40,000 horse archers. He offered peace. Romanos, overconfident in his massive multi-ethnic army, refused. On August 26, 1071, near the town of Manzikert, the battle was joined. Alp Arslan's strategy was classic steppe warfare. His horse archers would ride in, fire devastating volleys of arrows into the Byzantine ranks, and then feign a retreat, luring their heavily armored opponents forward. The Byzantines fell for it perfectly. For hours, the Byzantine center advanced, chasing ghosts, becoming stretched out and fatigued. As dusk approached, Romanos ordered a withdrawal back to his camp. This is when the trap was sprung. As the Byzantine line turned back, Alp Arslan's Turks, who had seemed to be in full retreat, wheeled around and charged. At the same time, the Byzantine rear guard, commanded by Andronikos Doukas, a political rival of Romanos, did something unforgivable. Instead of covering the retreat, Doukas spread the rumor that the emperor had fallen and marched his reserves off the field entirely. Betrayal again. The Byzantine army, its flanks exposed and its retreat cut off, was enveloped. The emperor's elite Varangian guard fought to the death around him, but it was hopeless. The Byzantine army wasn't just defeated, it was annihilated. And in the chaos, something happened that had been unthinkable for centuries. The Roman emperor, Romanos IV Diogenes, was captured alive. Imagine the psychological shock. The emperor, God's regent on earth, was now a prisoner of a man he considered a barbarian chieftain. Alp Arslan famously asked Romanos what he would have done had the roles been reversed. Romanos replied, "Perhaps I would have killed you, or exhibited you in the streets of Constantinople." Alp Arslan's response was chilling in its mercy. "My punishment is far heavier. I forgive you and set you free." He knew that a shamed, defeated emperor returning home would be more damaging to the Byzantines than a martyred one. He was right. Romanos returned to a civil war, was betrayed by the Ducas family, and was blinded and exiled to an island where he died of an infected wound. The empire, consumed by internal strife, could not defend its borders. The dam had broken. In the decades that followed, Turkish tribes poured into Anatolia, and the Byzantines could do nothing to stop them. The demographic and cultural character of the region was changed forever. Manzikert didn't just redraw a border. It erased the heartland of an empire from the map, creating the nation we now call Turkey, and setting in motion the events that would eventually lead to the Crusades. And if Manzikert was the slow death of an empire, number 5 was its lightning-fast, brutal execution. Number 5 is not a battle in an open field. It is the story of a city, one of the largest and most sophisticated in the world, being surgically and brutally erased from existence. In 1519, when Hernán Cortés and his few hundred conquistadors first laid eyes on the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, they were stunned. Built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, connected by massive causeways, it was a metropolis of towering pyramids, immaculate canals, and 250,000 people. It was larger than any city in Spain. 2 years later, it would be a smoking ruin, its people slaughtered or enslaved, its empire dismantled. The map of an entire continent was about to be violently redrawn. The context is crucial. Cortés was not just leading a Spanish force. His true genius lay in exploiting the deep-seated hatred the surrounding tributary states had for the Aztecs, who demanded constant tribute and human sacrifices. He forged a massive alliance with peoples like the Tlaxcalans, who provided the vast majority of the manpower for the siege. The shocking core is the siege itself, a methodical 93-day campaign of total war that began in May 1521. This was not a simple assault. It was a masterclass in psychological and biological warfare. Cortés's first move was to cut the aqueducts that brought fresh water to the island city. Then he launched a fleet of 13 custom-built brigantines, small warships armed with cannons, onto the lake. These ships, which the Aztecs had no counter for, allowed him to blockade the city, stopping all food supplies, and to bombard the city from the water. But the most devastating weapon was one the Spanish didn't even know they had: smallpox. An infected slave had been brought over in a previous expedition, and the disease, to which the native population had no immunity, ripped through Tenochtitlan during the siege. Eyewitness Aztec accounts, recorded in the Florentine Codex, are horrific. A great many died of it. They could not walk, they could not move, they could not stir. And when they stirred, they screamed. While the defenders were dying of plague and starvation, Cortés began his final assault. The fighting was street to street, house to house, a grinding, brutal advance. As the conquistadors and their Tlaxcalan allies took a city block, they would systematically demolish every building, using the rubble to fill in the canals so their cavalry and cannons could advance. They were literally erasing the city as they conquered it. You must try to comprehend the sheer sensory overload of that final assault on August 13, 1521. The thunder of cannons echoing off the pyramids. The stench of death so overpowering that the Spanish soldiers were getting sick. The lake water red with blood. The constant, high-pitched shrieking of the Aztec women, a sound that a conquistador named Bernal Diaz del Castillo said haunted him for the rest of his life. The last Aztec emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was captured trying to escape in a canoe. The resistance impossibly was over. The Spanish and their allies had won. The aftermath was the birth of New Spain and the death of the Mesoamerican world. On the ruins of Tenochtitlan, the Spanish built Mexico City. The Aztec religion was suppressed, its temples torn down, its books burned. A new racial and social hierarchy was imposed. The fall of this one city led directly to the Spanish conquest of Central and South America. The intricate political map of dozens of pre-Columbian civilizations was wiped clean and redrawn with the straight, brutal lines of European colonialism. And the next battle would redraw the map of the sea itself. Number 6 is the Last Great Crusade. It was the largest naval battle in the West since antiquity. A colossal clash of galleys powered by the sweat and agony of thousands of slaves, criminals, and prisoners of war. For decades, the Ottoman Empire under Sultan Selim II had been the terror of the Mediterranean. Its navy was supreme, its corsairs raided with impunity, and in 1570 it had invaded the Venetian-held island of Cyprus. In response, Pope Pius V managed to do the impossible. He united the squabbling Catholic naval powers of Spain, Venice, and the Papal States into a holy league. Their mission: to confront and destroy the Ottoman fleet and break its stranglehold on the sea. The two fleets met on October 7, 1571, in the Gulf of Patras, off the coast of western Greece, near a place called Lepanto. The scale is almost impossible to comprehend. The Holy League, commanded by the dashing 24-year-old Don John of Austria, had over 200 galleys and 6 massive floating fortresses called galleasses. The Ottoman fleet, under the command of Muezzinzadeh Ali Pasha, was even larger, with nearly 230 galleys. In total, nearly 500 ships and 150,000 men were about to collide in a narrow stretch of water. The stakes were total control of the Mediterranean, the lifeblood of trade and power for both Christian Europe and the Ottoman Empire. If the Holy League lost, Rome itself could be next. The shocking core of Lepanto was its sheer medieval brutality combined with a crucial technological edge. The battle was not one of elegant naval maneuvers. It was a head-on collision. The lines of galleys rammed into each other, and the fighting became a floating land battle. For 4 hours, it was a chaotic melee of cannon fire, arquebus shots, arrows, and savage hand-to-hand combat as soldiers swarmed from one ship's deck to the next. The crucial innovation of the Holy League was the galleass. These 6 lumbering ships were rowed out in front of the main fleet and acted as heavily armed battleships. Their broadside cannons, much more powerful than the forward-facing guns of the galleys, shattered the cohesion of the Ottoman formation as it advanced, sinking dozens of ships before the main lines even met. The sounds would have been a symphony from hell. The rhythmic creak of thousands of oars, the crack of the overseer's whip, the roar of cannons, the splintering of wood, the screams of the wounded, and the clang of swords on armor. On the Ottoman flagship, the Sultana, Ali Pasha fought bravely until a Spanish arquebus ball struck him in the head. He was decapitated, and his head was raised on a pike aboard Don John's flagship, the Real. The sight of their commander's severed head and the Holy League's banner flying from their flagship's mast broke the Ottoman morale. The battle turned into a rout. By the end of the day, the Ottoman fleet was annihilated. Over 200 of their ships were captured or sunk. As many as 20,000 of their men were killed, and crucially, 12,000 Christian galley slaves were freed from their benches. Lepanto was a staggering, decisive victory. While it didn't end Ottoman power overnight, they rebuilt their fleet with astonishing speed. It shattered their aura of invincibility at sea. Never again would they so seriously threaten the heart of the Mediterranean. It marked a permanent shift in the naval balance of power from the oar-powered galley to the sail-powered, heavily gunned man-of-war, a technology in which the European powers would soon excel. The battle redrew the mental map of Europe. It was a massive psychological boost, proof that the Ottoman tide could be turned. You can see its legacy in art, in churches, and in the very confidence of a Europe that was about to enter its age of global expansion. And from a battle won with overwhelming force, we go to one won by a handful of men and a single act of betrayal. Number 7 is the battle that conquered a subcontinent with fewer casualties than a modern traffic accident. It's a story not of military genius, but of corporate greed, political conspiracy, and astonishing luck. In the mid-18th century, India was a complex patchwork of states, with the Mughal Empire in terminal decline. European powers, particularly the British and French, were not there as conquerors, but as traders, operating through massively powerful corporations like the British East India Company. The richest of all Indian provinces was Bengal, ruled by the young and impetuous Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah. He distrusted the British, and in 1756 he captured their main trading post at Calcutta. In response, the East India Company sent a small but professional army under the command of an ambitious and ruthless clerk-turned-soldier, Robert Clive. The setup for the Battle of Plassey was a conspiracy. Clive knew his force of about 800 Europeans and 2,200 Indian sepoys was hopelessly outnumbered by the Nawab's army of 50,000 men and 50 cannons. So he decided not to fight the army, but to buy it. He entered into a secret plot with one of the Nawab's key commanders, a disgruntled general named Mir Jafar. The deal was simple. In exchange for the throne of Bengal, Mir Jafar would betray the Nawab on the battlefield. He would refuse to commit his large portion of the army to the fight. It was a gamble of epic proportions. If Mir Jafar got cold feet, Clive and his tiny army would be annihilated. On June 23, 1757, the two armies met at Plassey. The shocking core of the event is how close it came to complete disaster for the British. The battle began and Mir Jafar did nothing. He held his troops back, waiting to see who would gain the advantage. The Nawab's loyal forces, particularly the artillery commanded by French officers, opened a devastating fire on the British position. Clive's army was pinned down, taking casualties and on the verge of being overwhelmed. The entire British future in India was minutes away from being extinguished. And then the weather changed. A sudden torrential monsoon downpour soaked the battlefield. The British, being disciplined professionals, quickly covered their gunpowder with tarpaulins. The Nawab's army, less prepared, did not. Their gunpowder was soaked and rendered useless. You have to appreciate the sheer sensory shift. The battle begins with the deafening roar of 50 cannons, the air thick with smoke and the smell of sulfur. Then the sky opens. The world is reduced to the sound of drumming rain, turning the field into a swamp. When the rain stops, one side's cannons roar back to life. The others are silent. Seeing the Indian fire slacken, Clive ordered an advance. The Nawab's most loyal commander was killed. And it was only then, seeing the tide turn, that Mir Jafar finally made his move, leading his troops away from the battle. The Nawab, realizing he had been betrayed, lost his nerve and fled on a camel. His army, leaderless and confused, disintegrated. The battle was over. The East India Company had suffered only 22 men killed. The Nawab's massive army was scattered. Siraj-ud-Dowlah was captured and executed a few days later, and the British installed their puppet, Mir Jafar, on the throne. Plassey wasn't really a battle. It was the violent enforcement of a business transaction, but it completely redrew the map of the world. It marked the beginning of nearly 200 years of British rule in India. The immense wealth of Bengal flowed into the company's coffers, funding its expansion across the rest of the subcontinent and fueling Britain's industrial revolution. A private corporation had conquered an empire, transforming a few trading posts on the map into the jewel in the crown of the largest empire the world has ever seen. And our next battle would see the end of another empire, not in a swamp, but in a field of mud. Number 8 is the end of an era. It's the final bloody punctuation mark on 2 decades of continent-spanning warfare. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had redrawn the map of Europe in his own image, was back. Having escaped from his exile on the island of Elba, he had returned to France and raised an army in a stunning 100 days. The coalition of nations that had defeated him, Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, scrambled to assemble their forces to stop him once and for all. The two closest armies were a multinational force under Britain's Duke of Wellington and a Prussian army under the grizzled veteran Gebhard von Blücher. Napoleon's strategy was simple and brilliant. Drive a wedge between them, defeat each in turn, and force the coalition to sue for peace. On June 18, 1815, near the small village of Waterloo in modern-day Belgium, he faced Wellington for the final showdown. The shocking core of Waterloo is how profoundly it was affected by mud and timing. Napoleon had wanted to attack early in the morning, but heavy overnight rain had turned the battlefield into a quagmire. His artillery, his greatest weapon, would be ineffective, its cannonballs simply burying themselves in the soft ground. He was forced to delay the attack until late morning, waiting for the ground to dry. This delay was fatal. It gave Blücher's Prussians, who Napoleon thought he had knocked out of the fight 2 days earlier, precious hours to regroup and march to Wellington's aid. The battle itself was a brutal slugging match. Napoleon launched massive infantry assaults against Wellington's lines, which were strategically placed on the reverse slope of a ridge, shielding them from the worst of the French artillery. The key points of the battlefield were the fortified farmhouse of Hougoumont and the farm of La Haye-Sainte, which were fought over with savage intensity all day. Imagine Wellington's perspective. He spends the entire day plugging gaps in his line, watching his men get pulverized by French cannon fire and cavalry charges, constantly checking his pocket watch and scanning the horizon to the east, praying for the Prussians to arrive. The sound is a constant, deafening roar of cannon and musket fire, punctuated by the screams of thousands of men and horses. The air is so thick with black powder smoke that you can barely see 100 yards in front of you. By late afternoon, his line is on the verge of breaking. The French have finally captured La Haye-Sainte, and Napoleon sees his chance. He commits his last reserve, the elite of his army, the seemingly invincible Imperial Guard. The grognards, the old guard, had never known defeat. Their advance up the ridge was the decisive moment of the Napoleonic Wars. As the towering bearskin hats of the guard appeared over the crest of the ridge, Wellington gave the order. Over 1,500 British foot guards, who had been lying down to avoid cannon fire, stood up and delivered a devastating volley at point-blank range. The front ranks of the Imperial Guard were blown away. For the first time in their history, they faltered, they stopped, and then they broke. The cry went through the French army, "La garde recule!" The guard retreats. At that very moment, Blücher's Prussians finally arrived in force and smashed into Napoleon's right flank. The French army didn't just retreat, it collapsed into a terrified mob. The war was over. Napoleon's empire was finished. Waterloo redrew the political map of Europe for the next 100 years. It ushered in the era of the Concert of Europe, a conservative balance of power dominated by the victorious monarchies. It confirmed Great Britain as the world's preeminent global power, a position it would hold for a century. And it confined the man who had set Europe ablaze to a remote, windswept rock in the South Atlantic, where his legend would only grow. But as Europe settled into its new map, a new power was rising in the east, ready to draw its own lines. Number 9 is the day an empire's fleet traveled halfway around the world just to be systematically annihilated in a few hours. It was the naval equivalent of a public execution, and it signaled a seismic shift in global power. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 was a brutal conflict over imperial ambitions in Manchuria and Korea. To the shock of the world, the newly modernized Japan had been consistently defeating the forces of Tsarist Russia. In a desperate gamble to regain control of the sea and relieve their besieged forces at Port Arthur, the Russians dispatched their Baltic fleet. It was an epic, ill-fated voyage. The fleet, commanded by Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky, sailed 18,000 nautical miles from the Baltic Sea, around Africa, across the Indian Ocean, and into the Pacific. The journey took 7 months. The ships were fouled, the crews were exhausted and demoralized. Their target was the Russian port of Vladivostok. To get there, they had to pass through the Tsushima Strait, between Korea and Japan. Waiting for them was the entire Japanese combined fleet under the command of Admiral Togo Heihachiro. The Japanese fleet was smaller, but it was modern, faster, better trained, and fighting in its home waters. Admiral Togo had spent months drilling his fleet for this exact moment. The shocking core of the battle is its terrifying, almost mathematical efficiency. On May 27, 1905, the Russian fleet entered the strait. Togo, in a maneuver of incredible audacity, ordered his fleet to turn in sequence directly across the path of the advancing Russians. This was the legendary crossing the T. It was an extremely dangerous move, as it exposed each of his ships, one by one, to the full broadside of the entire enemy fleet during the turn. But it worked. It allowed Togo to bring all of his ship's guns to bear on the leading Russian vessels, while the Russians could only reply with their forward-facing guns. What followed was a slaughter. The Japanese gunnery was vastly superior. They were using a new type of high-explosive shell that tore through the Russian superstructures, starting massive fires. The Russians were still primarily using armor-piercing shells that often passed clean through the less armored Japanese ships without exploding. You have to picture the scene aboard the Russian flagship, the Knyaz Suvorov. It's almost immediately hit, its steering jammed, its command staff killed or wounded. Admiral Rozhestvensky himself is knocked unconscious by a shell fragment. The flagship, burning and out of control, drifts out of the battle line. One by one, the Russian battleships are targeted, isolated, and pounded into submission by the concentrated Japanese fire. The smoke from the burning ships is so thick it darkens the sky. The sea is filled with debris and drowning men. The battle raged through the day and into the night, as Japanese torpedo boats hunted down the scattered Russian survivors. The result was the most decisive naval victory in modern history. Of the 38 Russian ships that entered the strait, 21 were sunk, 7 were captured, and 6 were disarmed in neutral ports. Only 3 made it to Vladivostok. Nearly 5,000 Russian sailors were killed and 6,000 were captured. The Japanese lost only 3 torpedo boats and just over 100 men. It was a near-perfect victory. Tsushima redrew the map of global power. It was the first time in the modern era that a non-European nation had decisively defeated a great European power. It announced Japan's arrival as a major imperial force and shattered the myth of inherent European racial superiority. In Russia, the humiliating defeat was a direct catalyst for the 1905 revolution, which severely weakened the Tsarist regime and paved the way for its eventual collapse in 1917. The world had a new map, and a new aggressive player was ready to make its mark on it. And that brings us to our final item, a battle that was not a battle, but a city-sized meat grinder that redrew the map of the 20th century. Number 10 is the turning point. It is the moment the unstoppable Nazi war machine was not just stopped, but broken. Its spine snapped in the frozen rubble of a city named after the dictator he was trying to destroy. In the summer of 1942, Hitler's Operation Blue was aimed at the oil fields of the Caucasus. To protect the German Sixth Army's northern flank as it drove south, it was ordered to take the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. To Hitler, capturing the city that bore his enemy's name became a matter of immense personal and ideological prestige. To Stalin, holding it became a symbol of Soviet defiance. The city itself was turned into a fortress. The battle for it, which began in September, devolved into some of the most brutal urban warfare in history, what the Germans called Rattenkrieg, rat war. The fighting was for individual buildings, factory floors, and even sewer tunnels. Life expectancy for a new Soviet soldier arriving in the city was sometimes less than 24 hours. The main grain elevator was fought over for days, changing hands more than a dozen times. The Germans slowly, bloodily, pushed the Soviet 62nd Army back until they held only a few narrow strips of land on the west bank of the Volga. By mid-November, the Germans controlled 90% of the ruined city. They believed they had won. They were wrong. While the 6th Army under General Friedrich Paulus was being bled white in the ruins, the Soviet High Command, under Marshal Georgy Zhukov, was massing over 1 million men and 100 tanks on its flanks. It's on. The shocking core is what happened on November 19, 1942, Operation Uranus. The Soviet counteroffensive began in the middle of a raging blizzard. The attack was not aimed at the elite German Sixth Army in the city, but at the weaker Romanian and Hungarian armies that were protecting its flanks. The Soviet tanks and infantry smashed through these positions with terrifying speed. Within 4 days, the two Soviet pincers met at the town of Kalach, west of Stalingrad. The trap was sprung. The entire German Sixth Army, over 250,000 men, was encircled. Hitler, in a fit of delusion, forbade any attempt to break out. He promised the army it would be supplied by the Luftwaffe from the air. It was a promise he could not keep. What followed was 2 months of freezing hell. If you were a German soldier inside that Kessel, or pocket, you were trapped in an ever-shrinking landscape of ruins, starvation, and death. The temperature dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Ammunition ran out. Food ran out. Men were eating their horses, then dogs, then rats. They were freezing to death in their foxholes, their uniforms totally inadequate for the Russian winter. The constant Soviet artillery and sniper fire never stopped. It was a slow, agonizing death of an entire army. On January 31st, 1943, a haggard, broken Field Marshal Paulus, whom Hitler had promoted from his bunker in a vain attempt to encourage him to commit suicide, surrendered. Stalingrad was the psychological turning point of World War II on the Eastern Front. The Nazi propaganda machine couldn't hide the scale of the disaster. An entire army had been wiped from the map. For the first time, the German people saw that the war was not just unwinnable, but that it could lead to their own destruction. From Stalingrad on, the Red Army would be on the offensive, a relentless tide that would not stop until it reached Berlin 2 years later. The battle ensured the survival of the Soviet Union and redrew the map of post-war Europe, creating an Eastern Bloc under Soviet domination and setting the stage for the half-century of Cold War that would define the rest of the 20th century. We are back on the plains of Musée-la-Bataille, back with that Frankish infantryman watching the enemy's center collapse not from force, but from greed. He doesn't know it, but the world has just pivoted on his spear point. The future of his continent, the language of his descendants, has just been secured in blood and confusion. That is the pattern. These battles, these hours of concentrated violence, are the hinges upon which history turns. They are not just about armies and generals. They are about technology, like the paper captured at Talus. They are about betrayal, like the one that doomed the Byzantines at Manzikert. They are about disease, mud, and a single random arrow. They reveal that the world we inhabit is a fragile, accidental construct, built upon the ruins of countless other possible worlds that died in the screaming. The lines on our maps are not natural or preordained. They are scars. The next time you look at a world map, at the border between France and Spain, at the name Turkey sitting where Anatolia used to be, at the stark line dividing North and South Korea, that is a direct echo of Tsushima's outcome. Don't see countries. See the ghosts of the men who died to draw those lines. See the echo of a decision made in a moment of terror, which has shaped the reality you were born into. Tell me in the comments which one of these moments stayed with you. And subscribe, because the archives are deep and the next list is worse.